Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Table Talk on this Friday afternoon. As you're watching now, if you're watching on the day this is going out, we are just a few days away, Andrew, from Advent. We're hearing the Christmas music in the stores. We've experienced some snow. We all have the sense now that Christmas is coming culturally, but Advent and the Christmas season are sort of two slightly separate things. And before we talk a little bit more about some of the Advent resources that we have here at CBC Ilderton, Andrew, I want to take a minute and just let's talk about what is Advent and why is it so important?
Well, first we need to say there is nothing in Scripture that commands or commends Advent. So this is a practice that the church has had in terms of its calendar, whereby Christians have remembered Christ's first coming and his second coming. And it's an acknowledgement that we live in between the times, that we are waiting because of Christ's first coming for his second coming. Yeah. And so it's a season of waiting. It's a season of anticipation. So when we think of waiting, we typically think of standing in a line, of passivity, and we do a lot of that this time of year when we're out. But the kind of Christian waiting that we're talking about is the kind of active waiting, the waiting that is preparing the heart, the waiting that is looking forward, the waiting that is anticipating what God will do in Jesus.
A hopeful waiting.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so Advent, though it's not commanded anywhere in Scripture, it's a practice that I have taken up, and I've disconnected it from a lot of the other high church traditions, but I've tried to use it strictly as a season to reflect on Christ's first and second coming.
Yeah, and as you say, Advent has been a thing that's been particularly on your heart, and something that, as you've led this congregation, has been something that you've wanted to really lead the church in. And one of the ways that you've done that is through your writing. You've written now 3 devotional series about Advent through various parts of the Bible, and we want to take a little bit of time here today to talk through those a little bit. What are they? What was the motivation behind them? How can they be used? And these will be devotionals that will be available to anybody watching. We'll have them out, I believe, on Sunday.
That's right.
That's right, this upcoming Sunday, for you to use, because this Sunday is the first season of Advent. I learned recently Advent does not start on December 1st. It starts 4 Sundays before Christmas. So a little bit of a different calendar there. But yes, so Andrew, you've written 3 devotionals. They were, 2018, 2019, and 2020. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
That you did those? So 1 per year for a series of years. Let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to the first one. You wrote a devotional in the book of Isaiah.
That's right.
So why don't you tell us a little bit more about that one?
Yeah, so what I did in 2018 was that I began to think about what's called the fifth gospel. Isaiah is, it's probably the most, it's probably the most clear gospel presentation in so many ways in the Old Testament. And the New Testament writers actually pick up the word gospel from Isaiah, and they use it to talk about the good news. Isaiah talks about how blessed are the feet of those who bring good news. And so, in 2018, I wrote what's called Isaiah's Christmas. So Isaiah's Christmas really was my attempt to look at every single chapter, from chapter 1 to chapter 66, at this idea that Isaiah sees that there is both the first and second coming of Christ. And in a world where the covenant of God was being broken, where the commandments were being disregarded, where judgment was looming over Israel, here we have this message of God's promise that he would send a king in the line of David, that he would send a suffering servant to rescue his servant Israel, and a messenger whose voice would come to bring the message of hope. And in the face of God's judgment, salvation would come. But the salvation that God brings and he communicates through Isaiah's gospel is really a sense that he will save both the individual and he will save the creation. And so we look backward to the old creation and we look forward to the new. We look back to the first Davidic king and we look forward to the new Davidic king. We look back to the first Exodus and we look forward to the final Exodus. And Isaiah pulls all these things together, and what he's doing is he's painting this glorious picture in his day, in his context, of a redeeming work that God is going to do. I tried to connect Isaiah as much as possible with the New Testament, and where they're
pretty easy to do. Really.
It is very easy to do, and so wherever those links were throughout the New Testament, I was trying to connect them and paint the picture of the coming Christ. This is by far the most comprehensive and intensive resource for Advent. So if you're looking for something that's ambitious, you want to read through the entire book of Isaiah, it can be done in 24 days, and you can follow the devotional. It takes about anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes, depending upon your pace of reading.
And that's a good thing to clarify, I think. As we talk through these devotionals, if I'm correct, all three of these are assuming that there's Bible reading associated with them, right? This wouldn't necessarily be standalone devotional, but they're scripture readings as part of it. So
that's right.
As you're hearing us talk about these, just know that that's also a part of how these devotionals are intended to be read. And Isaiah really is such a remarkable book, and I think many people may have had the experience that of all of the prophetic books, it's the one that we can most easily latch onto in so many ways. We know so many of the passages so well from Isaiah, and in a way that is unique, I think, among the prophets. And many of you may have noticed that we read a lot of Isaiah during the Christmas season, during Advent, and there's a reason for that. And so this is a great resource for you to be going through.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Isaiah, as much as he's very familiar and common, he's also very confusing.
Yeah.
And because of that, that's part of the reason why I wrote this, is in the midst of what's very clear, there's also things that are very complicated. And I've tried to make a devotional that is simplified so that the confusing message of Isaiah can be understood for today.
So we start with Isaiah's Christmas. That's the first devotional that will be available to all of you watching coming up on Sunday for this Advent season. The second one, in many ways, is kind of the exact opposite.
Yeah.
We've got the large 66 chapters of Isaiah, comprehensive, to then in 2019 down to one chapter of Scripture, particularly in the first chapter of Hebrews. So why don't we talk about that one a little bit next?
Yeah, so this resource is called Veiled in Flesh, and I pick up Charles Wesley's hymn from Hark the Herald Angels Sing, where he says, "Veiled in flesh the Godhead see, hail the incarnate deity, pleased as man with men to dwell, Jesus our Emmanuel." And what I've done in this is I've taken the 15 verses from Hebrews chapter 1, and I've broken them down into phrase by phrase so that first you can read the whole chapter if you want, or you can memorize the chapter over 24 days because it's broken down into phrase by phrase. And then what I've done is it's not a commentary. So a commentary would go through all of the analysis of verses. What this is theological reflection or doctrinal reflection. And I'm looking at this chapter primarily from the lens of what does it teach us about the doctrine of Christ? Because Hebrews wants to paint this picture that Jesus is far superior to anything else. And because of that, we need to capture the wonder of who Jesus is. How did he come in the flesh? What does that mean for us? So each one of those doctrinal reflections then are intended to give us a sense of wonder and delight that God took on flesh, that he walked and talked among us, that he grew. Included in this, I think, are various quotations and prayers from saints of the past, or maybe a hymn, a Christmas hymn or Advent hymn, so that it would cause us to have a sense of wonder at the greatness of our God.
So for those of you who would want a more, maybe you could say, an intimate Advent devotional, one that is very focused and very zoomed in, this may be a great resource for you. And maybe for those of you as well who have found the book of Hebrews to be a little bit confounding. Hebrews is in many ways a complex and complicated book. And this is one way that you can start to maybe peel away those layers and unpack that a little bit. So
yeah. And in that, you're going through sometimes you'll go through a verse over 2 or 3 days,
Mhm.
and you're also going through the doctrine of Jesus Christ and his incarnation.
Mhm.
And the two things are happening simultaneously while reflecting the Advent spirit. And so I think it's a great little tool to warm your heart.
So we've got then the broad, expansive book of Isaiah. We've got Hebrews chapter 1. We've got both sides of that spectrum. And then the next year, in 2020, things were a little bit different in our world.
Yeah.
2020 was like nothing that many of us have experienced. Some maybe who have been around longer have had similar experiences, but many of us hadn't. And so there was a particular emphasis, a particular sort of change in the feeling of Advent in 2020, and that led you to a third devotional that you wrote. So why don't you wrap up our conversation on these devotionals by telling us about that one?
Yeah, so in 2020, I had started my most ambitious preaching series that I've ever done. It was preaching from Genesis to Revelation. And we were only a few months in, and I started to notice a pattern throughout the Old Testament, the promise that began in Genesis of rest, that God was bringing his rest, that God rested from his creative work on the seventh day, that he was inviting humanity into Sabbath rest. And this theme of rest actually began to become something I noticed all throughout the Old Testament. And so I began writing this Advent devotional. I call it an Advent devotional from Genesis to Jesus. And it's called The Weary World Rejoices. And in it, I was thinking about how this doctrine of the rest of God that he brings, his saving work, his creative work, and in his very heart and nature, God is bringing about rest. And so I began to reflect then on the story of the Old Testament. So while Isaiah is concentrated in a book and Hebrews 1 is a chapter, this takes you kind of it's a mid-grade. It's kind of in between those in terms of intensity, that you can take a chapter from the Old Testament and a little portion of Scripture from the New Testament, and you can consider the rest of Jesus Christ. The goal of that really was, how do we find rest in a world where we had been told it's 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and 2 weeks had become 9 months, and there was no end in sight. And we were we had just gone through a second wave of COVID, and we still didn't know quite the severity. We were going to face another lockdown, and there were all these pressures that were mounting. The economy was struggling. People were hurting, mental health issues all around us, people just grieving, finding it so hard. And so this devotional actually became probably the one that was a comfort to me more so than the other two, because I needed to know God's rest in a world where everything felt chaotic, everything felt full of turmoil. And that's really the story from Genesis to Jesus. It's these highs and lows. It's the stories of Israel going through these glorious days, first the dark days of being in slavery, to being in a promised land and seeing their king establish a throne and having that kingdom divided and being taken into exile, and then finally the one who comes to be the rescuer of all. And he's the one who, we're told, he brings rest to your soul. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest, we're told in Matthew 11:28 and 29. And so this devotional is intended for the weary person to be able to go through and see how there is rest in Jesus Christ.
Yeah, especially during 2020, especially during COVID, we all learned in a new way the comfort that is available to us in the Scriptures and in the Old Testament specifically, which is sometimes something that can be more difficult to see for people. So for those of you who would be interested in seeing that grand story from Genesis to Jesus as you consider Advent this year, that is a resource available to you. As we mentioned before, all of these have been printed and will be available to you. It is the 25th of November as we're recording. On Sunday, the 27th, we're going to have these out. We need to stop and say a thank you to Amy Nellum. Our printers have been just going full steam for days and days, getting all of these printed and folded and put together. She's worked very hard. We're very thankful for her. All of the artwork, I believe, that you see on these was largely put together by her. So we owe a lot to Amy in this, even though we're the two here talking about this. And one thing that I think is worth bringing up, worth talking about this, is you had mentioned earlier, there in Scripture we don't see this sort of command to celebrate Advent. This is something that is really meant to be an encouragement to you rather than a burden. I think maybe some people may feel in the business of life that Advent is another thing that makes me feel like a failure, that I'm not doing, that I'm not paying enough attention to. I know there's been years, certainly, where I've felt that way. We would want to encourage you that these are not meant to be a burden or an obligation. These are meant to be a joy to you, to be of benefit to you, to help bring the sense of peace and rest as we consider what Jesus has done for us and as we wait for what he will finally do in the end.
And to that, I would say, I want to encourage that if you pick up one of these resources, that the best way to use it is, number one, it goes from December 1st to the 24th. And that's because every year Advent constantly moves around. It's because it's the 4 Sundays leading up to Christmas. And this year it just so happens that those 4 Sundays begin on November 27th. But sometimes it's later, and sometimes it begins in the month of December. Mm-hmm. So just for consistency, it helps to have it. Yeah. The second thing is, to use the resource, it's ideal to have a space and a time. And so I got up early during Advent each one of these years to write these devotionals. Every day I would read the passage. I had mapped out where I was going and what I was going to do, but then each day I began to write and reflect. And for me, it was probably about, I took an hour or more in the mornings just to really spend time with the Lord. But for you, you don't have to do all the writing. You can do these devotionals anywhere from 5 minutes with the Hebrew devotional, the Hebrews 1 devotional, to about 15 minutes with the Isaiah devotional. And so depending on your time and your ability, that's one encouragement. But the other thing is, have a place. I have a chair that I love to just plop myself down in. I love to sit by the fireplace, and that's where I wrote these. In fact, each one of these, I spend a lot of time just sitting there, writing them and enjoying it. And so I would encourage you to do that. For the two devotionals, Veiled in Flesh and The Weary World Rejoices, they do end with either a quote from church history, or they end with an Advent or a Christmas song. And so that's to encourage you to worship and to pray. And so the goal is read the scripture. That's the most important thing. My devotionals are just devotionals. The second thing would be to read the devotional and then to let your heart worship, either in song or prayer, so that your heart would glorify the Lord.
That just about brings us to the end of our time here. This particular edition of Table Talk on Sunday, along with these devotionals, you may come in and notice our building looks a little bit different. We're going to get to enjoy all of the wonderful trappings of the Christmas season together in these next 4 Sundays of Advent leading up to Christmas. Andrew, before we go, for the loyal Table Talk listeners, any sneak previews for the future? I know you've said that you've maybe got some ideas in mind for another devotional. Any thoughts percolating in your head right now that you want to share? Any teasers?
Yeah, teaser is that I will be looking and mapping out John chapter 1, the first 18 verses. So it will be another complement like the Hebrews devotional, going through phrase by phrase through this great prologue that John has. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So that's going to be probably the next devotional that I will write for next year, and I'm looking forward to that. And I also should mention that maybe you aren't able to access these resources in person. We are putting them on our website, cbcelderton.ca. Under the resource tab, there will be a link to Advent, and there you will find a downloadable PDF copy. They're free. this is my service and joy to the church because this is what I'm paid to do. I love to do it. It's how I serve you. And so if it's a benefit to you and you want to share it, you're more than welcome. If there's anything you notice in it that needs maybe some tweaking, please let me know. I am going to revise the Isaiah's Christmas, probably over the next year. And so that resource will be refreshed as well.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us for this Friday's Table Talk. We look forward to seeing many of you on Sunday for our first Sunday of Advent. Till then, have a wonderful weekend. We'll see you then.
Bye for now.
Bye, everybody.